Hi guys, so let's continue to the second macro-sociological perspective. And this one is called conflict theory. Also interesting to notice the naming of the sociological perspective. Just as the first one, structural functionalism, conflict theory, the name tells how this theory envisions society. So let me start by summarizing the most important principles of conflict theory. So conflict theory is kind of exactly the counter narrative to structural functionalistic theory. So whereas structural functionalism sees harmony, balance, social structures working in a harmony as the core to how society should work and is working, conflict theory is a framework that sees society as an arena of inequality. And there's this pool of all kinds of inequalities. This is the root of conflict, the root of power imbalance, the root of oppression. It highlights divisions in society based on inequalities. Inequalities, think of them based on social class, ethnicity or race, sexuality, gender, ideologies about what should be gender roles, what should be social economic statuses, and the combination of these all, which is a nice concept we will talk more about in other units, is the combination of inequalities combined. We call that intersectionality. So this theory focuses on power, dominance, competition, and social change. Social change is an important part of conflict theory. Conflict theory doesn't only want to understand society, how it works, how its structures works, but it also wants to change society. So it has a political agenda. Conflict between categories of people bring social change. So the aim is not only to understand what I just said, how inequality is rooted in the way society is organized, but we also want to reduce inequality by promoting and bringing social change. Okay? So conflict theory has a materialistic view of society. It focuses on labor practices and economic reality. It takes a critical stance towards existing social arrangements, labor market, democracy, inequality between social groups. It doesn't believe that science can be objective. This is very true for conflict theorists, but also I think sociology is really influenced by this, and we will talk more about it, that your position in science, what you study, has an influence on your biases that you take into you when you study social groups. And social conflict theorists believe that transformation of society is not just something they want, but it is inevitable. It's like a natural order to constantly, conflict between groups, create new harmony, then there's conflict again. So there's this dialectical process recurring in conflict theory. The founding father is Karl Marx. I think you may heard from Karl Marx. So Karl Marx is the intellectual foundation for conflict perspective. Conflict theorists recognize ways in which social rewards are unequally distributed. And Karl Marx is one of the first scientists to shed light on how conflict and power disbalance is rooted in the labor process itself. Okay. Conflict theorists talks about have-nots and haves. Have-nots are those unable to get even their fair share of social rewards due to their category membership, and haves are those individuals and social institutions that gain access to more of society's scarce rewards. So there's an unequal distribution, and this is the root of conflict. That's where the name conflict theory comes from. And what conflict theorists want to do, they want to shed light on both visible, but also mostly hidden structures of inequality. So what types of questions do conflict theorists ask? How is society divided? How do some categories of people attempt to protect their privilege? What are the major patterns of social inequality? How do other categories of people challenge the status quo? Think here of Black Lives Matter. This is a beautiful example of in the now of how a group of people based on race wants to show structural patterns of inequality. Okay, so how's the social world according to these perspectives? We have oppression, haves holding the haves not back to maintain their elevated status. Patterns of inequality are here because of inequitable distribution of resources and rewards. Conflict theorists want social change to alleviate social injustice, and they want it to be rapidly done so have-nots can be held. So you see the difference in how conflict theorists and structural functionalists envision society. Structural functionalists see a society that is composed of structures, social institutions that are interrelated to each other and where there is harmony. Harmony is the natural state of society. Conflict theorists say, no, that's not true. The roots, the natural state of society is conflict, and that's because there exist inequalities. So if you would look only at harmony, if you assume that society is in harmony, you will overlook suffering. You will overlook unequal power distribution. You will overlook discrimination, poverty, racism, and think of other kinds of inequalities that are at the root of society. These inequalities are structural. We're talking about at macro level. Remember, a macro level theory sees society at the level of a panorama, big structures. Poverty is reproduced because society is not fair organized. Okay? So what would be the weakness of conflict theory? So conflict theory, what doesn't it see? Because it's only focused on oppression and making life better for the have-nots, it overlooks social harmony and equilibrium. Conflict theorists do not always acknowledge how disruptive and harmful change can be for the have-nots as well as the haves. And sometimes their pursuit has an explicitly political goal. And it wants to bring social change. And because of this, it sometimes lacks scientific objectivity. But let me just pause and say that the objectivity of science itself is a much disputable notion in science. And we will learn more about this, okay? And again, remember how I started telling you that each paradigm is a map or an angle of a map looking at social phenomena. So it's not none of them is perfect. Each bring to the table some core questions, some very solid theories, and it's only in their combination that we can have a broader, a much deeper look at the complexity of the societies we live in. So just a critique on both theories at the moment. Okay, we talked about structural functionalism and now conflict theory, and I think it's a good moment to think about what a macro perspective brings to the table. Okay, it gives us a broad picture. Okay, but it becomes too abstract. Okay, both macro theories we talked about envision society in very big container terms. Society becomes a thing on itself, and describing our lives as a composite of, for example, the family or social class makes the study of human behavior or the experience of the individual too abstract. You just can't put your finger on what poverty means for the individual. You can give a very perfect, nicely theory of why we have poverty. I could think of social reproductive theory, saying that poverty reproduces itself and social institutions keep doing the same mistake. If you're born poor, your parents were born poor, you will have maybe less education. This will again recur in a pattern, so it would reproduce itself. So you have a very intelligent theory on a structural level how you have something as poverty, but you're missing the point. What does it mean to be poor? What does it mean to be a homeless person? What does it mean to be discriminated because you're homosexual? What does it mean that people discriminated you based on your race? What is that suffering? And that is what macro theories overlook. But they give us the toolbox, they give us the maps to see the bigger picture. Another thing about both theories is that they're a bit old-fashioned, but they're still relevant enough to have breed more other theories. Feminism, queer theory, critical race theory, critical environmental theories all come from a combination of maybe a critique against structural functionalist theory or an embracing of conflict theory. So they have helped created the sociology we have today. Okay, they're not perfect, as I said, but they started to give us the tools to envision society, to learn and to question how society works. So, in order for us to understand the roots of conflict theory, I want to just reflect for a moment about Karl Marx and his analysis during the Industrial Revolution. Marx was very concerned about how this new form of production came to be, what he called advanced capitalism. And he was so concerned with the fact, how can a society that's becoming richer, how could be there so many poor people? And how can we change the situation? Remember, conflict theory wants to study conflict, power distribution, and also has at this root a social change agenda. So for Marx, what he did an analysis of how the production of labor, how the production system, what he called advanced capitalism, worked. So Marx held that advanced capitalism is an economic system based on the pursuit of maximum profit. And capitalism divides people in two major categories, and also a third one, a smaller group. You have what he called the capitalist or the bourgeoisie and the proletariats. And you also had a smaller group that was called the lumpen proletariat, and these were the perpetually unemployed people. Okay. According to Marx, the conflict between capitalists and proletariats has its roots in the process of production itself. The labor system was concerned with low wages for laborers and maximum profit for capitalists. So social change would be the only way to break out the system. What Marx concluded is that social inequalities increased during history. His analysis was what we call a historical materialist analysis of society. And he saw that agrarian societies were more equal than societies after the Industrial Revolution. Capitalism is grounded in other social institutions. Remember the social institutions we talk about? How structural functionalism sees how these big structures are related to each other and how they work to keep the status quo. In the case of the capitalism in the time of Marx, Marx saw that religion, political order, and morality kept that in place, kept this capitalism in place. And he talks about the concept of alienation, which is related with the concept of false consciousness. Let me explain to you what that is. So false consciousness is other political institutions, religion, morality, the law, all dictate that you are poor. It's your own fault because you're poor. Okay, you are born poor. You want to get out of poverty. You have to work hard. There were no laws protecting laborers, so each and all shortcomings were brought down to the level of the individual. Remember, we talked about personal failure in contrast to a sociological imagination. Personal failure seeing everything from the perspective of your fault. False consciousness carried that. And capitalism, according to Marx, was reproduced through these other social institutions, they saw it as the natural order of things. So we don't critique it, okay? So a laborer, proletariat would think, I don't have any talents, I deserve to be poor and remain poor. And God said, you should work hard. Marx thought, why isn't people rising up? How come they don't see, the proletariat, see that they are in the majority? If they just don't show up to work, the whole capitalist system would collapse. But there was something other taking place, something else that capitalism was doing and still doing to the laborer. And that's what we call alienation. I will come back to that. It is, for now, I can say that alienation is being alienated from yourself, from the products you produce, from your other co-workers, okay? You're whatever you're doing, what you're doing is surviving, waking up, working, 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 working. And you know how that can be? You become automatic pilot, mindless work does that, okay? So you're working, working, working. You're not even seeing that you are part of a bigger system, that workers are in the majority. So for Marx, he was thinking social change would come if the proletariat would discover his power. He would see that he is in the majority. He has agency. He has voice. And if all our laborers unite, they would show their power that they have. He calls this waking up the true consciousness. Okay, true consciousness or class consciousness. If they came to grips with the depths of their exploitation by the bourgeoisie and the capitalist system they controlled, he really believed they would wake up. Of course, for Marx, this would end in a more fair society, which would begin with socialism and would end up with communism. So back to that concept of alienation. Alienation is very important for us, and you will see it came from Marx, and it will continue to advance in other theories. Alienation is a concept that describes when the individual is made powerless because the individual feels or is isolated. He's doing dehumanizing work. His lived experience is one of not living a life in dignity, a life that can be more than just waking up and surviving. Okay, and for Marx, he talked of different alienation. Alienation from other workers in the same position, alienation from the activity of labor, alienation from the product of their labor. According to Marx, producing labor should be something life-giving, something that you're proud of. So you see your creation, it is life-giving. And of course, if you're only working and only thinking about surviving, you're alienated from others, from society. And I think the most important alienation is the alienation then from yourself, from your own specific humanity, from your power. And of course, the advanced capitalism of Marx's time was far from the capitalism we have today. Then there were no labor laws, and it was so much cheaper to hire children. There were no inspectors making sure that the workplace was safe. If you get injured, you have to come. So wages were incredibly low, working conditions were very bad, and you are so replaceable. If you got injured or you're not happy with something that happens at work, bye-bye. You could be so replaced by the pool of the people that are unemployed. And I think it's important for us to consider history here, but to also ask, is it true that we have a much more humanizing capitalist society? Do we have? Or is it that we have a more sophisticated capitalist society that goes hand in hand with more sophisticated problems? And brings us to new ways of interpreting conflict theory and using conflict theory and other more specific theories that can help us eliminate inequalities, shed light on them. Marx theory was an intellectual foundation, but it was too narrow. It only focused on economic inequality. And if we expand upon Marx's analysis, you would say that nowadays modern conflict theorists pinpoint other forms of inequalities. Social rewards are not only materialized in the economy, in money, but in things like race, ethnicity, sex, sexual orientation, citizenship status, age. Are you a disabled person? So inequalities are much more complex than only the economic oppression. Okay, we still talk about the haves and the have-nots, but now the haves have other type of power that the have-nots don't get access to. Think of political power, voice, agency, dignity, social status, prestige, education, cultural capital, and still a modern interpretation of conflict theory would argue that social change is important. And in contrast to how structural functionalists thought about social change is not something that should be slow. That would be another type of continued oppression. So conflict theorists still have a very urgent agenda to change society, to make it more equal. So this is modern society. I mean, it doesn't compare to Marx's time, but we have new inequalities. Think of migrants doing cheap labor, of human trafficking. And what would be then new forms in which conflict theory inspire new types of theories? Here are a couple of pictures you can see. Black Lives Matter happening now is one movement inspired by conflict theory, but also feminism. Let me just give you a couple of examples of other theories that branched out of the umbrella of conflict theory. We have feminist theories, we have critical race theories, queer theories, disability theories. Feminists wants to stemming from the second wave of feminism. We will talk more about feminism in another unit. They still argue that men as a category of people have greater access to social rewards than women. And this is again how social institutions work to keep that in place, or maybe we still have some old-fashioned gender roles that keep women in a less more advantaged position than men. Feminist is not only for women, by the way. It's for, it fights for equality among all genders. Critical race theorists focus on the social construction of race and how race brings discrimination and exclusion from resources of society. And one of my favorite theories, queer theories shed light on heteronormativity and discrimination against the LGBT community. Okay, and it also has a social change agenda. And disability scholars, how is society organized that only abled bodies can move through it and thrive? Disability studies help us to see society through a more fair, equal distribution of how we organize it. So what all these theories have in common, they still use Marx's insight that social rewards of society are not equally shared.